time travel paradoxes, Dungeons and Dragons simulators, and big buried airships. This fantasy is anything but final. I'm Meatball. Welcome to the Final Fantasy Review Anthology. I am taking on a monumental journey, to play through the entire Final Fantasy series. All of it. Okay, maybe not all of it. I'm not playing through 11 or 14 because of their online nature, but I will be playing the proper versions, or the versions that I like the most. So I'll be playing the proper remakes of Final Fantasy 1 and 2, of the Game Boy Advance versions of 5 and 6, the 3D version of Final Fantasy 4 and 3, stuff like that. So we all know the story of Final Fantasy. We all know it by now. We know the Square story, Square going out of business. They wanted one last hurrah. So Sakaguchi really wanted to make a fantasy RPG. But fantasy RPGs, they didn't know if they could sell well in Japan yet. I know that sounds weird to say, but there was a moment in time in history where fantasy RPGs, they weren't that popular, especially in Japan. The Sakaguchi originally wanted the title to be able to be abbreviated as FF. The original title was actually Fighting Fantasy, but because there was another game in the West called Fighting Fantasy, they had to rethink the title, and they came up with Final Fantasy, which is a much better title. So with Dragon Quest proving that a game like that could be successful, Sakaguchi started the project for FF. So they started development with only 4 people. That's crazy. The battle system was designed by Hiroyuki Ito, who had never played an RPG of any kind before, which is just insane. He took the basic inspiration for the battle system from professional sports, more specifically American football, where parties lined up on opposing sides and each side had a strategy. It's really interesting when you think about it. Katoshi Kawazo also worked with the battle system and said that he wanted to make it as close to Dungeons and Dragons as possible. So there were certain precepts to D&D environments, such as, zombies always being weak to fire, monsters being made of fire, weak against ice, stuff like that. Up to that point, Japanese RPGs just ignored these types of gameplay relationships. Now, Kawazu found this kind of irritating, and he wanted to really incorporate these precepts of Western RPGs into FF. Even the majority of the game's bestiary is ripped directly from first edition Dungeons and Dragons, like the Beholder, the Mind Flayer, the Ochu. It's kind of crazy. Even the original magic system was inspired by Dungeons and Dragons, with a Vancian spell per day kind of system, and many spells and even spell levels mapped directly to their counterparts in Dungeons and Dragons. The company initially forecasted the game to sell about 20,000 copies, but Sakaguchi was not happy with this. He had such faith in his Final Fantasy, he demanded at least 500,000 copies be printed. Square Company was like, "No, man, we're not taking this risk. We're gonna do 200,000." So when the first run came from the production facility, Sakaguchi took every ROM to every publication out there at the time and did his own PR. Like, Sakaguchi saved Square. He really believed in his project, Final Fantasy, along with the original Dragon Quest proved to be one of the most influential early console role-playing games, and played a major role in legitimizing and popularizing the genre. Graphically and musically, it was far more of a polished effort than many of its contemporaries, even Dragon Quest. So while going through these games and reviewing them, I will be pointing out motifs and landmarks that kind of show growth of the series. And many of the famous motifs that would become series staples started right here in the very, very first game, all the way back in 1987. Elemental crystals that need to be revived or rescued. Even the job system started here in a very basic kind of way. There was a Bahamut. There was a powerful dragon creature named Bahamut. Long gone advanced civilizations started back here in the very first game. Even optional super bosses and mini games started back in 1987. And of course, the musical motifs that we would come to know and love, like the prelude and the Final Fantasy theme and the victory theme, started back here in the very beginning, thanks to amazing series composer Nobuo Uematsu. So let's begin the review with the game's presentation. Now, I am playing through the Game Boy Advance remake of Final Fantasy I, the Dawn of Souls collection. Fantastic collection. It does this 16-bit Final Fantasy V facelift with Final Fantasy I. It's super nice. I really like it. Technically, the PSP 20th year anniversary version looks better. And it is kind of the definitive version because it has the most amount of new content and it fixes more of the glitches and whatnot. But there's just something about that 16-bit. That's the era I was introduced to the series, so I kind of like that look. So this is kind of more of a personal thing, but I really like the way this game looks on this new remake. New cutscenes were added in terms of like action set piece cutscenes that show off like certain action scenes. It's very cool. It's simple, but it adds. When one happens, you're like, oh, cool, something different and new. Wow. Now on to the game's sound. So the Game Boy Advance sound chip isn't exactly known for its quality. It's crunchy, it's compressed, it doesn't sound great. Sometimes it doesn't really sound good. If you listen to it with headphones, it's like, this is kind of grainy. Again, the PSP version is your best bet when it comes to the soundtrack. But don't let that take away from the fact that the soundtrack is still really good. And the Game Boy Advance version is still really great. There's some really, really great songs on here. The rearrangement and the orchestrations and the instrumentations of the original tracks are really great. It's kind of amazing, really, because Uematsu was able to make all these tracks with, just the 4-track Famicom chip. And he was able to add so much depth and breadth with just those 4 little things and weird little 8-bit blurps and beeps he was actually able to make music. Because back then music wasn't really focused on that much in video games. Final Fantasy music has always had a special place in the pantheon of video game music because it was the first series to really take music seriously, I think. And it really shows, this remake really shows that the songs, they still sound great. Here are a few of my favorite songs. Steve, can you go ahead and play these for me? Alright, now on to gameplay. So with this remake, they do add a really great amount of quality of life interface features. stuff that you kind of overlook nowadays because it's kind of bog standard when it comes to Japanese role-playing games. But back then they just didn't have, the faculty and the memory to really do any of this stuff. They added and optimize and remove equipment buttons, super great. The ability to sort inventory, R and L to swap menus really quickly. Basic menu quality of life stuff. Stuff, again, that you kind of look over these days, but compared to playing the original NES version, it's very nice. And the game flow itself, like I said before, it was inspired by Dungeons & Dragons, and it really flows like Dungeons & Dragons. At the very beginning, you're given a basic plot hook, and you follow it from there. You explore from there. It's basic, but tried and true. It's a fun respite from more complicated, hand-holdy, modern games. The game just kind of gives you little sprinkles. An NPC might mention something offhand about something in the West. Like, oh, I heard that this elf was blah, blah, blah in the West. And you're like, well, I don't have anything else to do, so I guess I'll go check out that elf thing in the West. You just do it. In older D&D, it wasn't as story focused. It was more about, here's a little plot hook. You follow the plot hook. You go in a dungeon. You defeat the monsters. You get the loot. Ding! And that's pretty much Final Fantasy 1. I do like the in-game map. It lends to that D&D open-ended adventureness. You open up the map, and there's just little red dots of interest everywhere. It's fun. It lets you know that, hey, something's over there. I don't know what it is, but maybe you want to check it out. It might be something cool. The game flow is actually pretty well designed, which comes from its actually pretty well designed world map. It has like this Metroid style world blocking, where it's either you're landlocked or you're sea locked, or you can only travel by canoe, or the fact that the boat can only dock at a dock. Stuff like that, like an encounter control. It doesn't railroad you too hard or lightly. It adds to that adventureness, which I kind of like. The dungeon maps themselves are serviceable. They're a simple D&D affair, honestly. Nothing really too special, not too complicated, not too many dead ends, and there's usually treasure awaiting someone who wants to explore. There are some diverse environments that use special tile sets, like lava tiles that do damage to you, or teleport tiles that are integrated into a maze. It's simple, but it works. It's basic, but not in a bad way. That's kind of the mantra of this game. Basic, but it's a good thing. And there is a good amount of freedom in this game. A number of quests can be done in different order, and sometimes you can just go off the rails altogether and do whatever you want. Not a lot of games can say that, like, especially back then, and even kind of now. The game just kind of allows you to make the adventure your own, which again is a very D&D thing. And also, this is just my experience, I never once had to stop to grind. One thing that you'll learn throughout these reviews, I don't like grinding. There's a difference to me between grinding and leveling up. Leveling up is when it's fun. But grinding is when you hit a wall and you have to go outside and hold down A and farm XP to get through a plot wall. That's not fun. That's grinding. For me, there was no grinding in this game. I never had to stop and fight enemies. I just did the natural method, as I call it, which I just fought every encounter, never ran away from an encounter, and the game was fine. Good experience distribution. There are a few smaller points. They did get rid of a lot of glitches and flaws in the mechanics from the original NES version. The attack placeholder flaw where you accidentally spend your turn attacking a dead enemy, basically. Bad design. It fixed many game-breaking stat glitches, like the fact that in the original NES version, intelligence and agility as a stat just didn't work. Hey, you want to be a black mage and a thief? Too bad, it doesn't work. But the game is not perfect. There are kind of these standard JRPG complaints that they kind of started here and they kind of are still around in a lot of games. For instance, it took until Final Fantasy VII, maybe, to solve this problem. The NPCs get in your way and you can't push them out, and they just lock you in. Why they couldn't fix this in the remake, I don't know. Another small nuisance that I don't know how and why they didn't fix. Opening up the map. Remember how I said I love the map so much? This is how you open the map in the game. The same way you opened it up in the NES original. Start and B. Okay, that meta made sense in the NES because you had limited input, but this is on a Game Boy Advance. Use L or R. What's wrong with you? It's so obtuse. I don't understand why they didn't just map it to another button. Not very good. And like with most Japanese role-playing games, the encounter rate is super high. There are games that I've played with higher encounter rates, but this one is still kind of annoying. It's just an annoyance. That to me, a really high encounter rate just means that they didn't balance the game well. Like, a player shouldn't have to constantly fight. That just means it's not balanced and that you're padding the game at that point. It's not good. And of course, this is just a product of the times, but the bosses they're super simple. None of them are really hard. There was no strategy to any of the bosses except for the final boss. I'll give him that. I did actually have to use some strategy for Chaos. They are about as deep strategically as just a normal enemy. And that's kind of a shame. They're just a normal enemy that has more HP and attack. Alright, whatever. Again, like really basic D&D. It's like a D&D with not a great GM. Where the GM's just like, this is your boss. He's a strong monster. He has lots of HP. It's like, no gimmick, no strategy. Okay. Alright, that's fine. You remember how I said how much freedom this game gives you and how it has this really cool feeling of an open adventure? And it's true, it does. But because the game is so old, there are certain points of the game where it's just walkthrough-itis, where it's just like, I don't know where to go. And not even that sometimes. Sometimes the game doesn't even tell you how to do things, so you kind of have to, mechanic-wise, you just have to mess around until you figure it out or look it up. It's just the thing of the times. And honestly, for a game that came out when it came out, there's not a lot of walkthrough-itis in this game. So, plus minus is alright. Now on to story. So in this remake and the following remake, the 20th year anniversary PSP version, they added a lot more dialogue. Not a ton more dialogue, but they fleshed out a lot of the characters. The opening is awesome. It's still one of my favorite, like, classic RPG openings. You know, the game just cold opens with this fanfare, and you can just kind of put your own personality on these characters. You're just in front of this town, and you're like, hey, a town. It's just like Dungeons & Dragons, because with Dungeons & Dragons, you kind of have to just make up a canon reason why your characters all meet in a tavern or something. So it's very D&D. So you go into the town, which is the only town around, and you talk to the townspeople, and they talk about this prophecy and the fact that there's a missing princess. And if you try to leave or you talk to a guard, they'll notice that you're carrying a crystal in your hand, and they're going like, the king is looking for the person with the prophecy, the crystals. You have to come see the king. So you can go see the king, and then you're given this mission to stop Garland, this dark knight who's kidnapped a princess. This is really interesting because it kind of subverts the old high fantasy trope of go rescue a princess, because in every game that come out before this, you know, Dragon Quest and, you know, Ultima and Wizardry, stuff like that, like the main pushing plot of the game is to stop the the evil knight or evil guy and rescue the princess, right? In this game, you do that, and then the beginning credits roll. It's like a movie. You're like, wait, the game just started? And I do love the bookended nature of the plot itself. The fact that the beginning of the game is you going to the Chaos Shrine and fighting Garland, and the end of the game is you going to the Chaos Shrine 2,000 years in the past and fighting Garland. It's just this nice bookend that ties into the time travel loop that you have to break. Speaking of the final dungeon, it's not that great. It's the weakest of the series in general. It's kind of interesting and proper that it's like an actual dungeon, but nothing to write home about really visually. The song is pretty cool that plays. The Chaos Shrine music is pretty cool. The second to last dungeon, though, is freaking awesome, because the second to last dungeon in this game is a space station. I know in later versions they, for some reason, reimagine it as just a floating castle, but in the original release it was explicitly called a space station. That's so cool. Again, that's kind of an Ultima thing, taking the fantasy and putting, like hard science fiction stuff in it. I like that type of stuff. Some people don't like that sort of stuff. I do. The fact that this game is like this world is like a fantasy world, but there's a space station above it from this ancient civilization that's more advanced. I like that sort of stuff. There's, of course, no real lore in this game. There's no real backstory of what the heck this thing is. It's still cool because it lets my imagination fill in the blanks, which, again, in D&D, you let your imagination just kind of do the work for you. Some negatives on the story, though. While interesting, the time travel loop twist it's not handled very well at all. It leads to like this multiple reality nonsense, since nobody remembers the time loop once it closed. I get they were trying to tell a much more complicated story than the hardware and software would allow them, so it's kind of forgivable, but it wasn't handled very well. And even in the remakes, they didn't really attempt to fix any of the weirdness of the time loop, which is a shame. And even though the game itself is built around talking to NPCs for clues about exploring, there are a handful of plot beats that just are way too obtuse to figure out. This kind of, links with my complaint in gameplay, but this is kind of the storytelling side of it, where as impressive as this game might have been in 1987, the limitations definitely affected its way of storytelling. It could have been done better, especially in these remakes. So those are my general thoughts on Final Fantasy 1 for the Game Boy Advance. I definitely say it's worth a playthrough at least once if you're a fan of the series, especially some of the later games. Maybe if you started in Final Fantasy 7 and never really went back and played the granddaddy, this is definitely the best way to play it, in my opinion, especially if you really enjoy the 16-bit era of Final Fantasy. This is a really great way to play it. While the game is held back a bit by a case of archaic walkthrough-itis, if you are willing to cleanse your palate, open your mind to experience kind of an open adventure, you really will find a classic landmark RPG that still plays very well and still has that Final Fantasy style that's still present today. I've been Meatball. Thank you for watching episode 1 in the Final Fantasy Review Anthology. Have yourself a beautiful day.